Welcome and thank you so much for being here today for what I'm sure was a very busy and impactful and long day at the PRI. My name is Maya Sariva. I'm the Interim Executive Director at the Institute for Sustainable Finance. We're very happy to welcome you here today to Capitalizing on Clarity, the Canadian Taxonomy in Action PRI side event. Today's discussion is hosted and supported by the Institute for Sustainable Finance and our partners at the Canadian Climate Law Initiative. And as we think through the important conversation today, I just wanted to make a quick plug-in. Yesterday, we released our inaugural Canadian Sustainable Bond Market Report, which shows that while bond issuances continue to be important instruments for green investing, the market has significantly dipped in the past couple of years in Canada. So this is just one small example as to the urgent need for a taxonomy to ramp up climate solutions. So before we dive in this critical discussion today, let us acknowledge that Smith School of Business, Toronto, is situated on the territory of the Huron-Wendat Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee. As we gather here in downtown Toronto, we are in a place protected by Indigenous peoples with a treaty called One Dish, One Spoon. The treaty was established to protect the harvesting of the land, waters, four-legged, and winged animals. This practice may seem like the old ways, but it can be said that this was the real beginning of commerce in Toronto. And as we think through this conversation today around finance taxonomy, let's keep in mind that the Toronto Indigenous community continues to reflect the area's Wendat, Mississauga, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee roots, and currently includes many other nations across Turtle Island. We're deeply grateful to be able to hold this event on this land. On the note, on the note of being grateful, I'd also like to introduce you to someone truly inspiring, MP Ryan Turnbull, whose energy, enthusiasm, and passion for all things sustainability, social innovation, and impact is truly contagious. Ryan was elected in 2019 and 2021 as the Member of Parliament for Whitby, Ontario, after a successful career in social innovation and sustainability. Shortly after his election, Ryan founded the Social Innovation and Sustainable Finance Caucus and initiated Ottawa's premier event on sustainable finance, the Sustainable Finance Forum, where we're one of the presenting partners this year in November. In 2023, Ryan was appointed by the Prime Minister to serve as the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, and more recently, he was also appointed Parliamentary Secretary to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance. Ryan has been instrumental in getting Canada's Social Finance Fund launched, making employee ownership trust a reality, and has relentlessly pursued advancements in climate finance, including advocating for the suite of investment tax credits, the launch of the Canada Growth Fund, and the implementation of a green and transition taxonomy, along with mandatory climate disclosures. So in all his work, Ryan is driven by his passion for building a more just and sustainable economy. So without further ado, please welcome MP Ryan Turnbull.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with you all, and thanks, Maya, for that warm introduction. Today is a really great day. It's probably my most fulfilling day in politics thus far. So it's great to be here with you all. The taxonomy and the disclosure is, I think, truly transformative. I'm sure I don't need to convince all of you of that, but I feel very passionately about it, as you can imagine. So I'll just make some opening remarks. I am going to join the panel just in case there's some questions for me that anyone wants to ask, or I can be part of the discussion. But I think everyone knows we're at a critical juncture in the fight against climate change. And without immediate and unprecedented action to stop greenhouse gas emissions, the climate emergency will have unthinkable consequences for our economies, our ecosystems, society, and our financial system. As part of Canada's commitment to the Paris Agreement, the government has pledged to cut emissions by at least 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. This is part of a commitment that we made through the Net Zero Accountability Act, which was our landmark legislation that entrenched in law our climate commitments, which will bind. I'm really proud of that because it will bind all future governments unless they try to repeal that act, which I think many people in this room will mobilize quickly to prevent any future government from trying to do that, or at least that's my hope. But to achieve these targets, we know we've got to cut emissions rapidly, and we know we need policy regulatory measures. There's many different policies that we've moved forward on, from the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People to the Sustainable Jobs Act. There's a Sustainable Development Act as well that we moved forward on. There's amendments to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. There's all kinds of other pieces of legislation that contribute to our fight against climate change. And there's also a lot of regulatory measures and changes that we've made. But I think, what we're here to talk about is really how the financial industry plays a key role and needs to continue to do so if we're ever going to reach our targets. You probably heard, if you were at UNPRI, I'm assuming everyone was there, but if you heard the Deputy Prime Minister today, she mentioned the investment gap that is really quite large. And so between 125 to $140 billion per year of an investment gap, that's a really significant amount. That's, I believe, the Canadian Climate Institute is the one that estimated that. So, I think today's announcement is really key because both disclosures and the taxonomy really enable the markets to start to fill that gap. And, as was mentioned in my long bio, sorry about that, but, there are numerous tools and pieces from investment tax credits to the Canada Growth Fund, which is sort of blended finance. And many of our, carbon pricing would be another one, but many of our targeted programs right across every ministry, we have the On-Farm Climate Action Fund, for example. We have a net zero a net zero transit fund, but there are many others. So there's about $20 to $25 billion worth of federal investments through grants and contributions to innovation, research, and climate action in various different categories of the economy. But that is by no means sufficient. The federal government will never be able to meet the investment gap that we have without collaborating and working collectively with our capital markets and the financial industry as key players. So to me, we cannot achieve our goal. Like, a lot of people out there think the federal government is going to help us solve climate change. And it's true, we are advancing lots of different policies and tools and regulatory frameworks. It's true. But without the financial industry, we will not get there. I'm so clear on that if we don't look at a systems change approach, a transformational approach, and work collectively across every industry, we will not be able to meet the climate challenge. So that's why, taxonomy and disclosure, I think, are so important, because again, they create the credibility, the transparency and accountability in the marketplace. Obviously, they work together, I believe, but the taxonomy really underpins the credibility of all the financial products and investments and activities that should count on the path towards net zero. So I'm very excited to be here. It was great to see the Deputy Prime Minister up there. It was great for her to give me a little bit of credit for this. I really don't think it's me. Like the advocacy, and I'm happy to talk on the panel if anyone has questions about the political process and how we get big things done, because that's something over the last 5 years I've really learned how to get some of the big things done that I really care about. I would say all members of parliament, all ministers, all parliamentary secretaries, senators, etc., they're all working on things that they really care about, and they're trying to get big things done. That's why you get into politics. It's not easy, let me tell you that. So most of you will look from outside like I did for my whole career, 13 years being a CEO of a company that I built, trying to do systems change from outside of government. You look from outside in and you go, what is taking so long? Why can't we get things right? And I get that. I totally get it because I was there for my whole career. I jumped into politics because I think it matters to have elected officials that are pursuing the things that they really care about, that are willing to mobilize coalitions of people outside of government and be the internal champions to mobilize internally. And I can tell you a lot about the challenges internally and how to get things done. But it's that coordinated effort. That's how we got taxonomy and disclosure done today. It wasn't me. Although I appreciate the kudos, it wasn't me. I mean, I know that it's nice to believe that we make a difference, and each one of us, I think, needs to do that. But Barb's van, everybody on this panel, everybody in this room contributed to that process. And if it weren't for your advocacy, if you didn't care enough to raise your voice, then it wouldn't have happened. So it's great to be here with you all. And I'm now going to turn it over to our wonderful moderator, Catherine McCall, who is moderating the panel tonight. She is the CEO of the Canadian Coalition for Good Governance, which is the country's leading voice for institutional investors, promoting the highest standards of corporate governance and investor stewardship in Canada. Catherine, thanks for being here. It's a real pleasure to be among such great leaders. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Ryan.
You need the mic?
Yes.
Yeah. It'll be more impactful.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So this is a big day. Investors have been waiting for a long time for sustainable finance taxonomy. Before I get reactions from our esteemed panelists, I'm going to introduce them. So to my immediate left is Andrea Moffat, who's the Senior Director of Sustainable Investing at Addenda Capital. Barb's Van, President and CEO of University Pension Plan. Nicole Jasbeck-Martin, who's the Head of Taxonomy and Natural Capital of the Australian Sustainable Finance Institute. Welcome. And Jonathan Arnold, Acting Director of Clean Growth Canada Climate Institute. Welcome, everybody. So Barb, maybe I could start with you to get your reaction to this big announcement today. And if you could briefly talk about how we got here, which I don't know if you can do that briefly. Yeah.
Going back 10 years.
Yeah, so the reaction is definitely positive. I think hearing that it's science aligned and hearing that it's third party arm's length governance with funding and a 12-month timeline to get things out. All great things because we need to keep the momentum going. In terms of how we got here, I think, I would say that there was a very keen group that I think cooperatives at the time, as well as many of the foundation community, that advocated to have an expert panel on sustainable finance, because Europe had one, and that's back in 2018, 2019. And two of our recommendations, one was a taxonomy that green and transition. We didn't really know the details. We could write like half a page about these ideas. And there was a disclosure recommendation. And at the time, ISSB didn't exist. It was TCFD. And so we had those two recommendations. And we also had a third one called the Sustainable Finance Action Council. And we actually debated action versus advisory. And we wanted to go with action because we actually wanted to get things done. And we thought that, we had great conversations over the 15 months of the expert panel. And we had probably 500 pages of typed notes. I still have today of people giving their insights. We said we really should continue that dialogue, and we really wanted to build out these recommendations. You need to continue to engage the financial community and others to get their insights, right? And how this could be done, how can it be pragmatic, etc. So, we published a report in April 2019. There was conversations about getting the SPAC started in 2020, but there was something called a pandemic. For those who, right? Just a little thing that distracted government, perhaps, right? But in that period of time, there was another group under the CSA, and I'm going to give a shout out to Peter in the back, because Peter was one of the chairs, trying to move forward guidance at that time, and working with industry, working amongst the financial community. And when the government created the Sustainable Finance Action Council, formally back in May of 2021, the CSA and Peter joined as well into the group, which was fantastic, as well as Sarah Thompson, his counterpart, the other co-chair from RBC. And we benefited from that starting work. And we then reached out because, you know, we needed climate expertise, so Jonathan. Then I discovered a student named Kaylin Welsh who is doing a master's in taxonomy. So those two deserve a lot of credit for the background work, along with the Institute of Sustainable Finance, and Smart Prosperity. So in terms of, you know, they were really the engine behind the scenes and bringing together a subgroup of the SPAC to debate, do the research, talk to Australia, talk to the UK, talk to Europe. We had tons of different speakers in. And then we finally started to try to put pen on paper. And that led to the publishing of the taxonomy report back in September 2022. And I can tell you there's many versions, but we got all 25 institutions to sign off. And I think that really helped in the last couple of years in terms of moving it forward. Over and over again, relying on people to have a voice in terms of different roundtables, different events, different letters, different standing committees. I've discovered those. So really kudos and thanks to everyone for that.
Thank you. That's an incredible story, and thank you to everybody that pulled that together. Andrea, what is your reaction to the announcement today?
We can share.
We'll share.
Well, congratulations. I mean, congratulations to everyone. This is a really big deal. I think we're looking for solutions. We're looking for how to transition the Canadian economy in a credible way. I'll emphasize again the science-based component of this. I'll emphasize that, even when Barb sort of shared the story, there was a lot of stakeholders involved. So certainly financial sector leadership, but many in the room spent a lot of time working on this. And I think we're going to need people to continue to work on this for it to actually be delivered, because as many people say, now that we've got the announcement, the work begins, right? So now that we've got a timeline, we've got 1 year to get things going, which is great to have that timeline as well. So yeah, I'm really excited about it. I'm interested in the details. As people know me, I'm a little bit geeky. So I want to get into the details. I think we're going to want to be involved in this process and be really active, but I think sometimes in this community we don't celebrate enough. So let's make sure we celebrate this this announcement. I don't want us to forget about the disclosure announcement as well, which is really, really important. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later, because the Canadian Climate and Law Initiative did quite a bit of work and analysis and supported that as well. So, yeah.
Thank you. Jonathan, what's your reaction?
I agree.
Oh, your mic too. Okay.
Feel bad.
Two mic.
Not turning my back on this side of the room, but yeah, I think it's a moment to celebrate for sure. I think what we were looking for in the announcement was for a process that wasn't too prescriptive and giving space for the body to be set up, the independent body that could establish the governance process and the content of the taxonomy itself, and that's exactly what was I think announced today. Happy to also see some guardrails around fossil fuels and no new natural gas, which was, I think, really important, and certainly what we had advocated for in the framework that we helped develop. I was trying to think of a apt metaphor for this, and Barb, I'm sure this has felt like a marathon for you, but I think whatever comes next has to be like a 1,500 meter race and not another marathon. I think it's going to be a lot of work, but I think it does need to happen quickly, and we need to get this going as fast as possible.
Hopefully the excitement will keep the momentum going. Nicole, did you have any thoughts about the announcement today?
Well, I think it's fantastic to share the joy. So to be in Canada and know, because we had this similar joy probably 18, 20 months ago now. So, absolutely thrilled. And as Bob said, I mean, we've been speaking with Canada for such a long time, recognizing just, how closely, almost parallel sort of streams and destinations that Canada and Australia have in terms of our economic profile and many of the same complexities and challenges. And so we've kind of been supporting each other along the way. And for Australia, you know, we're sort of a little bit further progressed in the work that we're doing. But I think that for Canada to come along as well, what it really does is create a coalition. It strengthens resolve within individual jurisdictions, and that creates the space for things to really embed themselves within the system. And so, you know, I think for Australia, we're just really thrilled that Canada are part of this journey now.
I'm going to use your word back.
Yeah.
So Barb, how important is it going to be to get the governance right?
Yeah, so I think you know, everyone who's been involved with different corporations, corporate main coalition of good governance, right?
For good governance.
For good, sorry. I should know that I was on the board. Governance is key. How decisions are made is key. Who's involved? What's the oversight? Absolutely key. So if you have a moment, as well as the announcement, the Sustainable Finance Action Council website is updated today on the finance piece. You will see an additional piece that is what we were doing in the background when we were waiting and the SFAC was still up and running, is we asked the SFAC members, what's really important about the governance that we want to see? And so there's a lot in there, but one was, you know, making sure that is at the table, at the council level, that is more than just the financial community. It's not just the finance folks, but folks from the official sector, folks from the community, folks from the Indigenous populations, folks from the provinces. And we tried to have efficient decision-making while having a big tent notion with the addition of these advisory groups. So we want to make sure that the consultation included more than just finance folks. And that really goes to the heart of credibility and goes to the best practices that you see elsewhere that the Institute of Sustainable Finance helped with doing. If you want to see that review, it's on the ISF website. Now, then there's a custodian that is well-resourced, that has, you know, the ability to reach out to the different groups, and especially the finance sector, and having the relationships developed that they can go to the community groups, etc. And as well as the technical expertise like CCI brought in for the SFAC community. And then the third layer around technical groups, and that's where industry plays, right? So we heard there that industry can't be at the decision-making level, but they can absolutely imperative to be inside the industry technical kind of groups informing the actual development of taxonomy. So there's a lot in there. There's also how this, you know, making sure that when recommendations are made up, you know, the technical expertise is within the custodian or the secretariat, so the council can't change it. They can send it back, ask for more research. There's, you know, public consultations. There's the notion of transparency. So we tried to embed what we saw was best practice elsewhere in there so that we can actually emulate the best governance that people have experienced in their lessons learned.
Thank you. Andrew, did you have anything you wanted to add about governing?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Barb covered it. I'm, you know, a little bit more of an outsider of the process, so I'll just maybe re-emphasize a couple of things. So the transparency is going to be really key. We know historically when standards have been set by industry for industry itself, it's not credible. We've learned that lesson. So it is really important that the voices of civil society, environmental NGOs, the broader community stakeholders are really heard and taken seriously. So I'll certainly be looking for that both in the structure, but then also as the process continues, because we'll have a better taxonomy. We'll have like more credibility. And what we're looking for in the market as an investor is longevity. Like we want to be able to invest according to this taxonomy for a long time. So that's going to be really important to attract the capital that we need for Canada's both solutions and also transition. So it's really important. And I guess the other thing is around the funding, which clearly, you know, is always a little tricky in terms of these announcements, but we need the, you know, independent third-party expert, I might not use the right term, like organization that's going to run this, plus the group that's gonna develop the actual scientific taxonomy, they both need to be funded with enough resources to do this really well and to keep in place some level of consistency. So it's got to be multi-year funding. And that's going to be the next steps, which are going to be still probably a little bit hard, but I'm glad we've got the timeline because hopefully we can just get things moving.
Thank you. A big part of the promise of the taxonomy is to attract capital and investment in Canada. Is this going to help accelerate investment in the transition? Maybe I'll start with you, Nicole.
Well, I mean, I think that is the motivation and the driving force behind the development of the Australian Sustainable Finance Taxonomy. Mobilizing capital was the key purpose that we were seeking to achieve. And so in the design, and this is really, something that we share with Canada, and again, have worked very closely behind the scenes in that initial thinking, is how do we design something that is fit for purpose, credible, science-aligned, and that can actually channel capital towards activities that will decarbonize the economy. And really the way that we've approached it from the Australian side of things is really thinking deeply about what we mean when we talk about transition. And I would say and encourage Canada, and I think you've already started that process in the work that you guys have done to really think through that, because transition is not a destination, it is a movement. It is you're moving towards something. You're either moving away from something and then you're moving towards something. And what we really wanted to include in the taxonomy is key decarbonisation levers or measures for existing activities that will move it to the direction of net zero. Otherwise, it's not going to be eligible because we really need to channel capital towards that future state. We obviously have not had the taxonomy in action yet. We're going out for our second round of consultation in October, so we'll be finished by the end of the year. But in that first round of consultation, and particularly when we're speaking to the mineral sector, so we were the first ones to sort of come up with draft criteria, really talking with industry around what is needed and coming up with this key criteria around transition that are going to help channel capital to the big decarbonisation levers. And early signals talking to corporate treasurers was that this is going to make a difference. We are going to be able to have conversations with our banks and say, these are the big capital investments that we want to make in accordance with our transition plans to get going. So we're very hopeful that that will be the case.
Or could you give us a real life example of how this is going to have an impact?
Sure. So, and the body of the work, you'll see a few examples. So the most obvious one people go to is the use of proceeds bonds. So you have green bonds. Transition bonds are still nascent. I think it's something like 3.5 billion only issued so far. Japan made a commitment of 125 billion over 10 years. So they were out last year with that announcement. So hopefully we'll see some development from them. So hopefully, remember, this is voluntary, so people can choose green transition where they want to be. That could lead to development to products or funds that invest in these, or it can lead to ability to be by the individual ones. It's also used in, say, in equities. So if you look at Climate Action 100 Plus or Climate Action 100 Plus or, sorry, it's been a long day, Climate Engagement Canada, there's a benchmark assessment framework. And one of the key metrics that we look at is the capital aligned to the taxonomy, like a taxonomy, so to the transition. And really in Canada, no companies are really reporting that because there's no taxonomy, right? In the global initiative, Climate Action 100 Plus, you have over 40% of the companies actually doing it now. And so it's going to be used as a tool for companies to start articulating CapEx over time, and hopefully then that will lead to more revenue aligned to the taxonomy. And that will encourage more equity investments that will be used for engagement and stewardship, part of what we do day to day for most institutional investors are part of that. So you can also see, we have heard from OSFI that they would like to leverage the taxonomy as part of their capital framework. So we're really looking forward. That will be up to them on how they do that, but hopefully we see progress there. That would also be leading. I think that, we might be 41st in Canada for the taxonomy, but if we do that, jump to a leading position, because that would really help the banks, right? Think of all the costs associated with this, right? It will really help the banks and others to align, to encourage, that will go right through the system and also help offset the costs around the reporting and all those types of things. This will also let OSFI and others understand where the money is going, right? So from a regulatory point of view, it helps provide better data to see where the gaps are, where is money going to, where's the banks lending to, etc. So there are many, many different uses. And there's Andy. Everyone was Andy. Also on the expert panel.
And anybody else have anything that they'd like to add to?
Yes. I think it'll be interesting to see how the taxonomy creates a framework for decarbonizing by sector, which I think with the 6 sort of priority areas that were identified by the government, there's some intentionality there. And I think what'll be interesting is to learn from other jurisdictions that have already done this, where, you know, capital providers and industry are collectively working together, and then to realize where there are policy fixes and changes that might be needed to get things moving. Because I think that that sometimes is part of the mix. I don't know whether Australia has found this yet, but I suspect, you know, I've been having conversations with numerous groups, and Barb and I have had conversations about this over the last couple of months to sort of hone in on, okay, what is the, like, to retrofit buildings, there's a bunch of policy changes that might need to be made, and they're small things compared to the big things that we've done to date, and they're not necessarily at the federal level. But I think when you have a kind of a coalition of capital providers and industry groups working together, and you have the federal government on side, we're going to be able to apply pressure in areas to get capital moving in the direction that we need, far better than prior to having a taxonomy. So I think it's going to help quite a bit.
Do you want to jump in? Yeah, I mean, just to actually echo everything you said, Ryan, and I think this is exactly what we're doing in Australia. So the 6 sectors that we've identified, they're also the 6 sectors that the Australian government is developing sector decarbonisation plans for, and identifying key levers where policy is needed to help support that. And we've been working very closely, in addition to the governance and the technical work, and, you know, very much aligned in terms of the governance model that Bob was talking about. We also work very closely with our federal government bureaucracy, talking to them about what's actually on the inside of those plans. Can we ensure that the activities that you're really looking to incentivize and support are in the taxonomy? They're very interested in then backwards using that taxonomy criteria to help shape incentive schemes, grants, etc. So it's this virtuous cycle. And to give the example back around the building sector, the Australian government announced $1 billion in energy efficiency upgrades for homes. And this is really important. Like you said, it's something that really hits every individual in their homes, the comfort of those homes. And we've been coordinating with our Green Bank, who will be the wholesaler of that money. They've been working with us on the taxonomy criteria to ensure that that money is actually going in that direction. So that coordination can be really, really helpful. And then you've got government and the private sector really talking the same language, pushing in the same direction.
Andrea, could you talk a little bit about what kinds of investment products the taxonomy is going to support? Oh.
Sure, happy to. And I think it follows on nicely from your comments, McCall, because we do need to be talking the same language. And so, you know, just a quick example at Addenda, we do have climate transition funds, and it's been really hard. Like, it's been really hard to come up with our own criteria, maturity, like how do we assess performance and progress, and to be transparent about that to clients that are interested in that fund. So having the taxonomy and allowing us to use that, and that, you know, everyone is following the same process, will be just so helpful, and will also hopefully allow us and many others, you know, colleagues, to develop new types of financial products to actually release more investments in different types of asset classes. So and then finally, though we may get to this later, is it will really help around the whole greenwashing risk, right? Like we can actually be like, here we go, this is the definition, we all agree on it, we can report on it adequately. So there's multiple things that this is gonna help relieve that we've all been concerned about. So.
Thank you. Anybody have anything for Jonathan to add?
I think when we started this work with SBAC, we saw this as fundamentally a market failure of just an asymmetry in information, or just not enough information in capital markets, and not enough standardization in how that information is collated and translated. So that was our starting point, and our perspective on this has always been about identifying transition risk and transition opportunity, and having that as kind of the bedrock of the framework, and making sure that that is standardized and communicated in a way that everyone in the financial system is singing from the same song sheet. So that's kind of been our approach on it.
There's also an initiative within the government for one of the other recommendations around helping release the data within the government that would be helpful to investors on this topic. So the taxonomy can help provide the metrics, which then people can go back and say, okay, how do we help people actually get the right information to actually measure those metrics? Because data, disclosure, and taxonomy, all three kind of go together. And so in Ryan's example, for example, with the buildings, like the Canadian Green Building Council, I get that one right. They're trying to figure out how to get some of the detailed data to actually do the things that they need to do. And without that piece, it doesn't all kind of work together.
Jonathan, what kind of projects will the taxonomy support, and what do you think the impact will be on heavy emitters?
Well, I mean, just start with the green activities. I think that's probably where it's most intuitive, and where Canada can learn from other jurisdictions that have already done this well, like Australia, like the EU, and import most of that and kind of get going on that relatively quickly. I think it will be more of a process in developing the guidelines and metrics for the transition side, but I think it can make a tangible difference in defining what transition looks like for the cement sector, for example. So facility looking to install CCS on a cement plant, for example, that could maybe be eligible for that transition label. In the mining sector, if a mine is looking to replace its diesel haul trucks with battery electric vehicles, that's the type of investment that this would be targeted at. So we're really specific things that can lead to transformational change within historically heavy emitting sectors. So there's a whole range of examples, but I also think it is important not to get too far ahead of the process, and just, again, giving space to the independent body to do the work necessary to figure out exactly what would be considered transition and what would not be.
Anybody have anything?
Well, I mean, just on the example of the electrification of mine sites. So we have one particular mining company that are looking at a $6 billion CapEx spend to decarbonize their mine sites. And they are, really the prospect of getting a greenium on a $6 billion capital spend to decarbonize their mine site using the Australian taxonomy criteria is an extremely appealing proposition. And we are starting to see other mine sites looking to, this is where it starts to pull through. So, I mean, that is a huge capital investment, that is money flowing, but that is also massive transformation within a whole region that can really have an impact. Oh yes, okay. Well, that is where you get this a nicer rate if your corporate green bond or capital expenditure is green aligned. And just to the point of some of particularly on the mining sector, right, that they have traditionally been excluded from green finance, and for many years for good reason. But what we're really looking at is moving forward is an unprecedented growth in particularly the minerals that are going to help to build the green economy. And so looking at sustainable pathways for these critical mineral areas and encouraging them to move and shift to this sustainable pathway is, I think, really needed and necessary. And so they are the most attracted, I think, by the prospect of being able to come in and access this type of capital.
And the one thing we haven't really talked about is in the main report, we also talked about the general requirements. The company has to make a commitment. What is their transition path? Then there's the specific requirements, but we haven't talked about that there's also the requirement for the do no significant harm. And I think, getting that out now, so there's a great area of alignment for Australia and Canada in terms of, there's lots of frameworks out there. There's already the rules and regulations within the different countries, but there's lots of great responsible frameworks out there that we can leverage. And I think that clarity and also trying to aligning on common ones would also help bring clarity to the different industries of what investors are looking for in terms of doing things without harm and doing things responsibly.
How are these rules or laws going to interact with the taxonomies with the other jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, and I think what we're really seeing at the moment is, and I spoke about this a bit today in terms of that harmonization internationally, but that localization where needed. And I think taxonomies is a really good example of where you actually do need localized taxonomies. The framework does need to be the same. It does need to be science-based. It does need to be on 1.5 aligned scenarios. That's your starting point. And I think to the extent that we can also align on a methodological approach to the way in which we approach transition at a methodology level, that all, I think, needs to be aligned, and then you can go into the specificity of the individual countries. So you might have a different baseline, you might have a different makeup of your energy system, which might flow through to slightly different ways in which you get to your net zero pathways. And I think when you have that, and I was speaking to many international investors as we've been doing a bit of a usability roadshow with the taxonomy, how are you guys going to use it? Is it going to be usable? What data do you need? So many have said to us, look, we will use a combination of different frameworks, but what we want to see is in their minds, and I don't want to use the word equivalence because it's not equivalence, but what we want to see is that we have a credible benchmark frameworks. We have the EU, we know the EU is credible. We can have Australia, we know that that's credible. We can, if Canada comes alongside that, then what they're really looking at is where I'm making my investments, and it's that there's that level of interoperability. I can actually then go into a lot more granular detail when I'm assessing assets and portfolios of assets that are in that region. So it almost becomes one large framework with regional specificity that I think can become very, very helpful for international investors.
And I think there's going to be technology solutions. So we saw a few examples when we were doing our work in terms of, I think it was the Singapore Monetary Authority that funded one platform. So I think as these start getting more and more involved, you'll start seeing some technology solutions as well.
We just to add to that, being in innovation, science and industry in our ministry, we just added $3.5 billion in the federal budget for research and innovation across our post-secondary institutions. So it's mainly focused on applied research, but there's lots and lots of innovation happening. We have all kinds of other, so I think the government's role starts to be one where we're trying to help get the project pipeline investment ready, like as many investment ready projects as possible. And then where needed, I mean, we have grant-based programs, we have incentives, we have a whole bunch of tools at the federal level that can help build that pipeline. And I think to date, it's been a bit fragmented if I were to be self-critical, self-reflective. And I've said that quite often to the various ministers and even the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister that, our approach is like we're throwing everything at the problem we can think of, but how does it, enable the market effectively? So I think, we're going to be able to reevaluate as we go and say, but it's not going to be government imposing things. It's going to be more industry and capital provider led, saying, okay, well, here's the framework we've created. Here's what we need. And I think so there's an engagement piece there that I think is really significant, that it's going to change the way we work together. And that's going to matter. It's going to get us further faster.
So I know you're further ahead than we are, not not necessarily that far because it's not been acted yet, or it's not happening yet. But what can we learn from what Australia's been through?
So I love sharing everything that we've learned, because I think it's really helpful, and that's really what others have done with us. So I'll go a little bit into the weeds in terms of a few things, and I think you guys have touched on a lot of them. So that collaboration piece is absolutely key. As I shared on our panel earlier at PRI today, this was an industry in Australia, was an industry-led process. It was a process of collaboration, and we had a 14-month period of scoping and getting everybody in the tent and agreeing on what that framework could look like. And what we really did as part of that process is use that process to educate, to get people across and understand and get a level of consensus around what we want. And I think that what you've explained, Bob, is also you've taken people along for that journey. So that's key and that's excellent. I think to have governments stepping in a leadership role, even though you're going to have industry and civil society leading the technical process, that convening power of government really creates that kind of team Canada, team Australia, but also really focuses them on. People know that this is something that is serious. And I think what that has done is, even though we know in both our jurisdictions that they're going to be voluntary in the initial sense, people are saying that this is the official taxonomy and we're going to start to use it. So you don't necessarily need to integrate it in the ways in the regulations initially, because you have that convening power. So really congratulate you guys for stepping up for that, because it is a harder slog when you don't have that convening power. The governance piece, I just want to reiterate everything that Bob has said, and again, something that we unashamedly stole from you guys, because they were very generous in sharing their information, and we really drew on those early governance models and research to inform our approach. But a couple of things to just touch on, which I think have really, really worked for us, is to have that tiered approach and to ensure that you have the right people at the right times in the right spaces, who have got the capacity to nut things out. Because, it comes down to activity by activity. We do debate for a lot of time on key technical issues, and you need people to have the confidence that they're able to do that in a safe space and then you have the governance around that to come to a decision. And so what we do have is, obviously we have our technical expert committee, who are made up of, again, like you guys are proposing, finance sector from across the tiers of finance. And that's really important to have the banking voice in the room, together with the asset owners in the room, together with the insurers in the room, because they do all have different needs and come from different perspectives. To have elements of civil society in the room, to have technical experts in the room, even at that decision-making stage, to have First Nations representation in the room. That is all really important. So we've had that. And then to have that separate from industry, who can provide a lot of technical advice, but they should not be the decision-making body. Because industry are often representing one activity or one sector. You've got to cover off on many, many sectors. And so you really need to ensure that you have that separation. And then lastly, with that convening power of the regulators, and we've got our Council of Financial Regulators, which is made up of our Reserve Bank and our prudential and corporate regulators, sitting as a oversight and strategic body over the top. To, again, they don't have decision-making powers, but they're really, I guess you could say, guiding how this work is being developed. And we found it very helpful not to have them in the room with the decision makers, because again, some of the decision makers are regulated by the regulators, right? And so it's, but to have them sitting as that oversight body and to have that feedback loop and that mechanism. And together, what we've really found is it has created a cohesive input and feedback, and allowed a lot of diverse views to feed their way through. And we hope that, we believe and we hope that others see it as well, that the criteria is much better for it.
Thank you. There was another announcement today about amending the CBCA, and Andrea, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how this taxonomy should work with mandatory climate disclosure.
Yeah, so I'll try and talk a little bit about it. It was a little vaguer, the announcement piece, but I'm going to talk about some of the inputs into that, because the Canadian Climate and Law Initiative spent a lot of time sort of supporting the government and providing some analysis on that. So I'll maybe just share a little bit, because I think people know less about it. So I guess first of all, this is a, you know, a potential amendment to the Canadian Business Corporations Act, which has implications for federally regulated private companies. So this is not the publicly listed companies, because we've talked a lot about disclosure around that. So I just want to be super clear on that. And in terms of what CCLI was suggesting could be a part of it, which was not part of the announcement, but I'll just go through what they were looking for, which is really requiring in financial statements, so the statements that private companies provide to their shareholders, to include climate transition plans that are aligned with Canada's climate goals by 2050. So essentially, again, science-aligned climate transition plan, which we also heard Mark Carney talk about today at the PRI, and also 5-year targets for emission reductions, and then annual progress reporting. So really trying to capture the need for private companies to also be a part of this transition and to be accountable, which I think is really important. The other piece, which I'll just mention, because CCLI did some amazing analysis, and it's too bad that Jane Sarah isn't here to talk to it, so I'm sort of a stand-in, a weak stand-in for her, to say the least. But the recommendations that this could happen over a period of time, and initially it would apply to, you know, approximately just over 1,000 companies, and these companies have an average income of about $389 million and average assets of 1.47 trillion. So the reason I'm giving you those numbers is these are not small companies, like these are large companies. And so just like how we have publicly traded large companies doing this, we should also have our large private companies doing the same. And then of course, over time, it could apply to other avenues. But, and just one more thing, you know, I know that it was, there's been a lot of conversations. Ryan's been working really hard with ICID on this, and that still a lot more work needs to happen on that. So I certainly encourage people to continue to support that particular announcement and the sort of advocacy support and engagement that's needed to get that over the line going forward.
Yeah, can I add a couple of things there?
Absolutely.
Just because this has been, you know, quite a challenge to get across the finish line, and there's reasons. I mean, there's people probably know, and Barb, you mentioned it before, just how many levels of government and different regulators would be involved in having kind of a comprehensive approach to mandatory climate disclosures. Obviously, we all want transition plans. I think that is the future. I 100% agree. I think the government took time internally to analyze the various options for the legislative tools. And there was some pretty hot debate around what was the best method, because typically, like, the CBCA is not, I mean, it is the tool we've chosen because it is probably the best tool, all things considered. But it is really a registry. It's a business registry, right? So it really only requires disclosure to shareholders. I mean, ideally, we'd like disclosure, public disclosure. That would be ideal. But we couldn't get that. And so there were other options considered of other tools, like the Canadian Environmental Protection Act was considered. There was consideration of using both tools and seeing if we could do things that way. Ultimately, we landed where I started with Jenna a couple of years ago, which was that amendments to the CBCA would be the best option. It's what I wrote my private members bill on, with Janice actually working with me before I became a parliamentary secretary. So I lost my spot to do a private members bill. But the point here is that the CBCA is still has some challenges. It only covers 14% of the economy. There's only 14% of the economy that are federally registered or federally incorporated private companies. So really, it doesn't cover public companies, and it doesn't cover any companies that are provincially incorporated, of which there are many, many, many more. So ultimately, so what we chose was to make an amendment to the CBCA in the fall economic statement. So I'll have to get that through committee and through Parliament. Like, that has to get to royal assent in order for it to happen. So keep in mind, if Parliament or the government falls before that happens, it will not happen. So people need to be aware of that, right? So we're looking at, well, what windows do we have to make this? What's the simplest way to move forward? And the CBCA is a very small, relatively small change to that act that can give us the authority to essentially tie disclosures to the size of the company or its emission intensity, which right now is not included in that act. So right now you can only, so these are the debates and like the internal side of politics that most people don't see. We call it the sausage making of policy, and most people are like, we don't care, their eyes glaze over. But really it's what you have to deal with when you're in politics to get these big things done. And it's important to keep that in mind, that it's not quite as simple as, oh, we just, like, Canada doesn't work like other countries. We don't have a federal securities regulator. If we did, things would be slightly easier in some respects. Or if every private company was only registered federally, we would have a lot easier time doing this stuff. So we ultimately have to start somewhere. So essentially the complexity is, start with a small change to the CBCA, give ourselves the authority as a federal government, get it through Parliament, and then we start a regulatory process, which will work with provinces and territories, the governments, to amend their legislation or their registries to have the same requirements. And we want, and everybody in the government believes, and outside I think as well, would agree that having alignment across all of the provinces and territories, and having alignment between disclosure requirements for private and public companies, they should be the same, right? There shouldn't be an asymmetry there, otherwise we're going to really run into problems. So what we need to do then is to go through a consultation process when we develop the regulations and ensure that provinces and territories follow suit, and so do the securities regulators. That's going to be the undertaking. And so that's
Not a small matter.
it's not a small matter, exactly.
Yeah. A little bit further. So I think Janice, Sarah calculated a few other numbers, and I can't remember the number of companies, but really when looking at large, you're talking about 1 or 2% of that private companies. Like because there's really some big ones and a long tail of tiny ones. And those are the ones that we're not asking for disclosure from. You know, I was sitting across the table from a company that perhaps makes frozen food and does a lot of agriculture the other night. And it's really interesting because them as a large company, they run their own farms, and then they get produce from other farms that are small. And because they run their own farms, they don't have to go out to each individual farmer. They have a good understanding that if you do the process this way, it's going to be about this amount of emissions, et cetera. And so, they are also helping, so they can estimate it fairly well, right? So there's lots of innovation going on. So if you can get the large companies going, they will also help the supply chain, right? And I think, so the quicker we get started, the quicker it'll go through the supply chain and will impact the smaller ones, and either directly because they're going to be asked to do that they're a decent size, or you'll get larger companies, figuring out how to estimate it more accurately than they do today.
I want to leave enough time for some audience questions. I had a couple more questions I wanted to run through here before we turn to the audience. Jonathan, how do you expect the taxonomy to evolve as our understanding of science evolves?
It's a big question, but I think, this is going to be a dynamic process, especially for the transition category of what's in the taxonomy. I mean, it's going to be a dynamic process, as you alluded to, Nicole, and making sure that these benchmarks do change over time and reflect the evolution of what we consider kind of science-based and credible. So no doubt it will change, and maybe that there are some activities that would be eligible for that transition label today that wouldn't be in 5 to 10 years, and that's just the nature of the slope of those lines for each sector. Those slopes will increasingly get steeper the longer we delay, both globally and domestically as well. And I think that's also important to recognize.
Yeah. How will we know that the taxonomy is working as an impact?
I think Barb mentioned it earlier, just in terms of the issuance of green and transition bonds, and because there's a very low baseline of transition bonds, especially in Canada, it's easier to attribute, I think, the success of the taxonomy on the transition side. It's a little bit harder to get attribution on the green side, because you expect that will just go up kind of anyways, and then the taxonomy will kind of boost it. I think there's that. There's also a qualitative piece to this as well, just in terms of speaking with the people who use it and speaking with the stakeholders and rights holders that are involved in the process, but whether it's working for them, whether they're actually seeing it in use in their day-to-day, and whether it maintains that label of credible, independent, and science-based, which is a process. That isn't something that you just get from day one and forever have. It's something that you need to maintain. So to make sure that everyone involved in the process kind of believes in it still over time, that's gonna be a big part of it.
Yeah, we'll also hopefully have OSFI collecting the data so that we can actually see the stuff that isn't public as well. And hopefully you also see with the companies that they start reporting CapEx aligned measures, right? And then you start seeing that go up. That would be another point improvement.
Okay, I'm turning to the audience now. Does anybody? Yes.
I had a look
I think
can we just talk here? Toby Heaps, Corporate Nights. I just wanted to take the moment just to, because we don't always celebrate when big doors open. This was a big door opening. And there's a merry band who really pushed, Barb, Andy, Tiff, and Kim, and Andrew was drumming, beating the drum long before. And then Ryan, thanks for being our Lorax in the sausage factory. But I'm thinking about.
Clap, 'cause
but I'm just thinking this is like a constructive question, but I've heard that there's this other guy in Ottawa who's looking for promotion maybe in the next 12 months. And I'm just wondering what we can do to make this taxonomy resilient to potential that potential happening, like in terms of enshrining it as official, the reference in existing government departments, language reference points, so that it's default already official. It doesn't need a stamp from anybody when it's ready. Hopefully in much less than 12 months. And also, second question for perhaps Mr. Arnold, if there's any thing we can do to speed it up, maybe leveraging the 6 income tax credits for the clean economy that already exist and have technical guidance or in process or done, that and 83 billion of money attached. If there's a way to sort of just kind of take those details and maybe speed things up and get this thing done in a few months. But yeah, just maybe right.
Well, I think I'd like to believe that we can entrench things in law and in independent bodies that will move forward. I think the taxonomy in some ways, because it doesn't require a legislative change, could get up and running fairly quickly, and I will say that that's the intention. And I think once it's funded and up and running, it'd be very hard to stop it because it's outside of government. So you can't repeal that. Like if a conservative government were to get elected, God forbid, for this work, I mean, I have, not to be overly partisan, but I'm a member of parliament in the governing party, and this work is important to us, and we're championing it and moving it forward. As tough as that is sometimes, it's real progress. I don't have the same hopes. Just to be really frank and honest about it, like the legislative change we're hoping to make, if for some reason the government fell, before that change is made, I don't envision that those mandatory disclosures will be getting done anytime soon. So all the more reason to make sure that we manage Parliament and do the very best we can. We have a team at the House Leader's Office that is working on that every day to make sure we can get stuff done. But ultimately, we'll have to get the fall economic statement through Parliament to royal assent in order to make sure that that omnibus bill includes the surgical change to the CDCA that we really need. So, but it can be repealed, right? So that's the reality in politics.
Maybe I'll just give a little bit of some of the conversations while we had the taxonomy expert group up. So it's green bonds, but there's also green loans and other things. We wanted to make sure that also it's easy to implement through the different banking systems, et cetera. So we had a fair number of conversations like, can you leverage the Canadian Green Building Council work, right? And make it very simple. Can you leverage other certifications, especially at the beginning to get it up and running, ultimately with the council to decide. But there is a lot of stuff out there. When we went out for different experts, there's lots of different frameworks. So I think as the secretary or custodian gets set up, that would just, the whole inventory of what's out there is a key part of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think especially on the transition side, I think a big part of it is identifying the science-based pathways for each sector. I know Australia has started to do that really important work. That takes time, but it doesn't take a ton of time. So that's possible. But I think the bigger part is just the engagement side. That takes a long time to bring everyone along. And I don't think we should underestimate that. But to do it well, to get the buy-in, that is going to require certainly some time. I think the 12-month timeline is definitely doable, but it's going to require a lot of work to get there for sure.
Anybody else have any questions for our panel? Yes.
Hello, thank you very much for all your work on this file. One place I found the announcement slightly vague as well was around credible transition plans. So could you specify whether these will be required as part of the new disclosure requirements under the CDCA?
Not to my knowledge, because the CBCA amendment doesn't require anything. It gives the government authority and power to essentially tie new disclosure requirements to the size of a private company that's federally incorporated. So essentially we're giving ourselves the power. That's the very small change. So it's really what is going to be required is a regulatory process, which will take consultation. So technically it could be included if that consultation process, which is with the intention of aligning with provinces and territories. But so the question I would put to you is, can you convince provinces and territories and security regulators to level up, to ante up what the federal government is trying to do? Or are they going to go for lowest common denominator, which would be probably scope 1 and scope 2 to start? To me, it's up to that consultation process, because the intention is to align across jurisdiction. So if they say, well, no, we don't want to require disclosures, or we don't want to require more than scope 1 and scope 2 to start, then that's going to be the baseline that's set, because we can't force them, right? The federal government cannot force provinces and territories to do anything. We don't have that ability. So, but the investors in this room can probably have more influence on them than we can. So I put it back to you.
So I can add to that a little bit. So in the taxonomy roadmap report, one of the general requirements was a transition plan, right? So you don't want necessarily a company issuing green bonds or a transition bond in one segment without kind of a holistic plan doing something in another part. So that was fairly dated in the report, so it's there. I would also say it's a big point for engagement that we have if you look at Climate Engagement Canada, we are engaging with the top 41 emitters outside the 4 that are in Climate Action 100 plus. One of the top questions is, do they have a transition plan, and is it credible with sector relevant targets? And that benchmark data is released on that website every year. The next one's coming out November 7th. And just to give you context, that 41 companies are 90% of the emissions on the TMX. So it's a significant chunk of the emissions. It's something that we'll continue to push for. And we're up to 52 organizations now from investor community backing that.
And I'll just like reback that up on how important transition plans are. So we know that OSFI is, requiring transition plans. So that's like, 400 of our regulated financial institutions. And, they're going to need some of that data and information from the companies that they're invested in. So it would be really helpful for all of those institutions if transition plans were included by both the securities regulators as well as part of the private company.
I also note, 6 weeks ago or so, ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board, announced that they're going to take on or put into their guidance the UK Transition Plan Task Force material. So hopefully we'll see that at some point mid next year. And there'd be a great opportunity for Canada to have a fast follow with, what is needed outside of that guidance that Canada needs so that people can build credible transition plans. And so, we're also talking to ISSB about their timing and how they're going to be rolling that out and the type of work and consultations they have. So there's lots going on. And I think investors, I know the SBAC was focused on climate, but investors are actually focused on ISSB S1 and S2. So the sustainability metrics that originally were SASB, as well as the climate metrics. And that's actually what we're asking for from CSSB today.
Just to emphasize one more, the synergies between taxonomy and transition plans are very, very clear because your taxonomy really is that opportunity classification list that sits there. And a lot of guidance, the guidance has come out of the SBTI, out of GFANS, out of the Transition Plan Task Force, the ESRA, so the European regulation that's coming in, all see alignment, capital alignment, as a very helpful and recommended KPI when you're tracking the progress of your transition plans. So they will be very complementary.
Yeah, when I was talking to the EU co-commissioner of the EU Sustainable Finance Platform, but they would like ISSB to have a voluntary metrics that is CapEx aligned to taxonomy as part of the ISSB framework.
Maybe just to add one last thing, I hope that we do get mandatory transition plans, but I think it's going to take some time to get to making them mandatory. And I think probably the best case scenario from my perspective is to have scope 1 and 2 mandatory disclosures embedded and aligned across jurisdiction, aligned public-private. And, if we can start there and phase in scope 3 in the following year, perhaps, I think that's, and then work on transition plans for the future. Like, I think the momentum will be there to continually raise the standard. And I think that's where we need to go. There's no question about it in my mind. And I wish we could rush and jump right to the end, but I think realistically it's going to take some time. It just, yeah.
Keep going back and forth on this question. So one thing that ISSB could also do and others is that, within scope 3, there's 15 categories. And you often hear from companies that that's overwhelming, blah, blah, blah. Most times it's 2 or 3 categories that are relevant for a particular company. I mean, you have SASB standards that are now S1, they're all industry specific. So they could go into those industry specific and say, for a company starting down this process, you're likely these categories, right? So there's many ways to help move this thing forward, and we're talking to the different groups about which part can they do.
So I just wanted to echo congratulations to everybody as well. And there was a lot of talk at the PRI conference about the need to engage policymakers like never before. And I think investors traditionally haven't been actually that great at, or it's something they really need to learn how to do. And, sort of taking up your offer of, showing us a bit more of the sausage making behind the scenes, like tactically, what should investors do differently? Like, should we hire a GR firm? Should we be more united? I know we're good at trying to engage companies to not, lobby against climate transition. But I feel like we're sort of babes in the woods on this. And if you have any recommendations from everybody on that as well.
Yeah, we could have a whole session on this probably, but I'll give you a few thoughts that I have. One of the hardest things I find about doing the job that I do every day in politics is because we get bombarded with lobbyists and people coming to us with asks. Like, I get hundreds of them every single week. I've got, so many meetings. Every group's got an ask. And then, most groups come to me and if they're like, their success is determined often by how succinct and how well they're equipping me. Because a lot of the things that they come to me with, I actually agree with. I want to try and move forward, but I only have so much bandwidth. And, the groups that come to me with 15 asks, like I say, come back to me when you have one. Because if you can't decide, like we did the Sustainable Finance Forum last year, had 600-ish people. I penned a letter based on everybody's advocacy and input that we wanted to get taxonomy and disclosure across the finish line. And that made the difference. Like that letter, it wasn't just a letter. Keep in mind, if I were to tell you the story about how many conversations I had to have internally and how many meetings I had to have with the Prime Minister's office or the Deputy Prime Minister's office or other cabinet ministers and get them to all advocate for the changes that we wanted. I probably bore you with that because it's a lot of just small conversations and pushing and pushing and pushing. And then educating my caucus, so 150 plus members of parliament, that I'm engaging constantly to support the ask that I have. But I had one focus for pretty much the last 2 years. One focus was getting this announcement today to get that across the finish line. So could I have gotten 10 asks done? No, I couldn't have. I had to focus on one thing that was really important. So, and I get many, many asks per day. And so, hiring a GR firm is probably helpful, but even more than that, because, I'll get 90 seconds on the microphone at a national caucus meeting and I'll pitch once a week, one idea. And on this topic, I'm allowed to say what I talked about. I'm not allowed to say anything else because it's confidential what happens in caucus, but I can tell you what I pitched. It was this announcement over and over and over again. I talked to my colleagues as to why this was important. So you've got to look at inside and outside, like you have to have a strong coalition outside. Learn this time and time again, the 3 things that I've got across the finish line. You have to have a very strong aligned coalition outside of government that has one clear ask. And you have to make noise about it. You have to educate the public about it. You have to think about how you're solving a problem that the government needs to solve, right? Because it matters to Canadians. Not because it matters to you, but because it matters to Canadians, right? And, and then you've got to figure out how to communicate it to someone inside of government that's willing to take it up and be your internal champion. And then they've got to run circles and weave a network and garner all the support needed internally. And then be very strategic about trying to get the key ministers to support that ask. And eventually go straight to the Prime Minister's office, because ultimately, I can tell you the story really quick. I announced the Prime Minister coming to the Sustainable Finance Forum last year, and he looked at me before he came out on stage and he said, "Ryan, you look really tired." I said, "Yeah, well, this forum with 600 people." And and he said, "What do these people want?" It was a funny moment, right? But he said, what do all these people want? Why are they gathered? What do they really want? I said, they want taxonomy and disclosure. That's exactly what I said. The only thing I said to him. He looked at me and said, "Okay, we're going to get it done." Right? And so I wrote the letter. I had the conversation direct with the Prime Minister. But I had hundreds of other conversations between that moment, which was last year in early November, to this year to get this across the finish line. So that gives you a little window into it. I could probably make other recommendations, but those are some of the things that I could say.
I won't have as good stories as Ryan. But there was a lot, even after the report done, there was a lot of opportunity to work with the Finance Department and ECCC. We brought in other people. We asked them would it be helpful to talk to this person or that person as they did their work and consultation. So we tried to facilitate the dialogues, not necessarily be in the room. I think there's one interesting pilot from PRI over the last 2 years. They've been engaging with Australia, and they had over 50 conversations within the Australian government. And what they do is they have some domestic investors, but they also have some foreign investors, especially those who buy the bonds. And they say, this is what we're looking for, and this is where the trends are going. Today, unless you do X, Y, and Z, you will no longer qualify for these buckets. So that is what, 12, 14%, any number of products that they sell. And you qualify for this. So it's not about divestment, it's about not qualifying for all the buckets. And so they try to at least come at it from the perspective of financial and trying to inform them, this is where the products are going. And if you like to stay in, here are the things that you need, and try to be very clear on that ask.
Okay, yes, one last question.
Thank you. Congrats to the panel. This is a long time in coming. And I think the disclosure announcement was a real pleasant surprise. I guess my question is for Ryan. With Bill C-59, what are the conversations happening within government at all about the impacts on disclosure and the future of C-59?
And so C-59 for you, because to me, that's a really big omnibus bill.
The anti-greenwashing.
Yeah, I figured that's what you meant, because that's one, like I got that bill through committee on the first day of being parliamentary secretary to finance. And it was like, I can't believe I got that bill through the finance committee on one day, because it was like 400 pages long. And that was one almost footnote in all of the things that were being proposed in that omnibus bill, because that was the previous fall economic statement. So anyway, but to your point, so I was heavily involved in that process of negotiating with the opposition parties to strengthen the Competition Act. I know that this has caused some consternation, certainly for some of the investor community out there. And I understand why, I've had conversations with them, but ultimately I support the fact that we need to ensure that we crack down on greenwashing. But I guess to the heart of your question, I can speak about the change we made, but how does it interact? Is that kind of what your question is?
Yeah, because I think it's perceived. I work at TD Bank, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
So we've seen clients pull back on disclosures at a time when we need more disclosures. It's causing green recession.
Right.
At a time when we need more disclosures. So I'm
because they're scared that they can't back up the claims that they're making.
Exactly.
So I guess we have to ask
not scared.
Well,
but
do they have evidence to back up the claims that they're making? That's what I would say, because if they did, they wouldn't be scared to disclose. That's the whole point here. We made it essentially illegal to make green claims or sustainability claims, general claims, or product-specific claims, right? And we said, if you don't have evidence to back it up, then you can't make that claim. Essentially, the Competition Bureau can come after you for making a false claim. I think that's a good thing. I don't have any problem with that. And I understand that other people are concerned about it, and maybe they should be. That's how I feel about it. I'm being very honest with you. But so maybe they need to gather some evidence before making those claims and be able to back them up. And I understand that there's some nuances to areas where maybe you can't, I've talked with some folks about in agriculture, for example, carbon sequestration. It's difficult to measure. There isn't enough. So are we limiting our ability to make so I get that there's so maybe we need to do something within C-59 or some additional changes in the future so that we don't limit our progress in specific areas that we can identify. So I think that's very rational. I'm very balanced about this, but at the same time, there's a core sort of values, commitment that I have, which is that you shouldn't be just able to make sustainability claims unchecked. That's greenwashing. I mean, we all agree that greenwashing is a bad thing. It undermines the credibility of the entire market. So to me, that's how I feel about it. So I hope that's helpful.
We're waiting for more guidance, right?
Should really change.
What's that?
We're waiting for more guidance.
Yeah.
From the Competition Bureau.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people as well CCGG has submitted, what would be helpful to the investor and the financial community, because I think not always the intended target, but the way it was written, I think it all of us went, oh, this applies to us, right? And the quantitative is one thing, but the qualitative statements are a trickier thing, especially when you don't have fully built out taxonomy, et cetera. So I think there's work to be done in many parts of that.
But it will create demand for taxonomy, so that's a good.
Yes, that creates demand for the taxonomy and disclosure.
I agree.
Unfortunately, we're gonna have to wrap it up, but I wanted to give everybody,
There's another question, but
yeah,
that's
I
okay.
think we're running out of time. I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to give any recommendations, where do we go from here? Any closing comments? Start with you, John.
Enjoy the moment, like get to work.
Good advice.
I would just say I see enormous opportunity for both our jurisdictions to continue to support each other. I think that really that international collaboration and alignment is very, very powerful. Finance cross borders, and particularly for our hard to abate sectors, for things like sustainable mining. There is a lot we can collaborate on, not just in terms of our approach, but I think really critically, we both have, powerful history and future in First Nations communities. We will be the first taxonomy that are embedding First Nations rights and cultural heritage as part of our social safeguards, and we really hope that we can work with Canada to do that as well. So really looking forward to that.
Yeah, that's one area of weakness we see with Climate Engagement Canada for all the companies, and no likely improvement this year. Yeah, so for me, I don't know, I get to hand this off to other people, so I'm pretty excited. You are enjoying it, but I think there is a huge engagement by the Sustainable Finance Action Council, by the 25 organizations, by the official sector, by a lot of people outside. And I think with this announcement, we heard when we were wrapping up the SFAC, that they were really waiting to see this commitment by the federal government. And I'm hoping that they will all continue to re-engage, because they put a lot of energy into, if you go onto that website and you see how many documents were produced, and every one of those documents, we made sure we had all those organizations endorse what was written. So it was a lot of time and effort to make sure that we had that level of buy-in. I would encourage you to look at some of the other areas. So we worked on data, we worked on disclosure and taxonomy. There is a prioritization survey on that website that articulates what the SFAC community thought were their priority sectors, and which ones they thought were easy, which ones they thought were easier, and which ones were challenging. But the fourth work stream started about halfway through SFAC, is about removing the barriers. So what are some of these barriers that can be solved by, whether it's government helping at the early stages of transmission lines in terms of getting PPAs and things into place, or blended finance or other things. And that work, we just kind of scratched the surface, right? So I think that's a future area. Hopefully there'll be a home for that picked up, because I think that's another area where the finance community can help create, not give grants, but give guarantees, right? So how do we actually use that to really get some of the things unblocked?
I was going to let you have the final word.
Okay. You weren't gonna? So I would say, what's next? I'm looking for my next challenge, the next policy ask. But I would say November 28th and 29th, we're having the Sustainable Finance Forum in Ottawa at the Shaw Center. I hope you'll all attend, because it's a chance to influence the federal government's agenda. I want to package up whatever it is that keeps the momentum moving forward on all of this work as a package of policy asks or initiatives from the federal government. So I'm looking for the best ideas of what's next. So that's my challenge to the group here, is communicate with me, give me stuff to work on. I'm interested in moving this work forward and getting it in the next federal budget. And the last thing I'll say is, how do you explain the importance of this work to a 12-year-old or 15-year-old child. You know, I had a conversation with my daughter this morning and I explained to her why today was so fulfilling for me. And she got it, you know, and it was a very simple conversation and it was very basic. But she said, yeah, Dad, we're changing the world. And, you know, for me, like that's how we need to talk to the general public. And if we don't bring the public along, like one of the challenges we have in the political environment we're in today is we're losing a portion of the public. We're not bringing them along. And I take that as a personal challenge already, but I would say help us because this work is too important to continue, and to lose portions of the public that might oppose this work is just heartbreaking for me. So please help me figure out how we, you know, message this to the general public and make sure that we bring them along. So thanks.
That's really tough to follow. But, I would say my biggest thing is let's not lose the forest for the trees. Like this is about changing our systems. We want a competitive economy so that we can have good jobs. We want to have strong communities, right, that see their future. And we want to make sure that we're really thinking about the impacts on the sort of the environment and people. Like that's kind of why we're doing this. So this is a lot of plumbing to make sure that we can get those results. And that's kind of the important part of this. So, yeah.
Well said. Please join me in thanking our panelists.